Hey, everybody, welcome. This is week 3 of doing a live each Sunday in 2023 in order to prepare for the AP Lang exam. So, my goal this year is to go live once a week. As the exam gets closer, though, it'll probably be a little bit more frequently than that in order to help students prepare. So, my goal is to answer questions that students have, anything about multiple choice or the FRQs. So if you're just joining, feel free to ask any of your AP Lang questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the AP Lang exam, especially anything with the essays, because I know a lot of students are working on essays right now. So if you have questions about AP Lang essays, let me know. And also, if you're joining on TikTok, feel free to tap your screen to like the live. That lets other students know that I'm going live and that it's worth attending. And also, if you're on YouTube, feel free to like the stream there as well. So welcome to those that are just joining. We're going to be talking about AP Lang stuff today, specifically anything you have questions about as far as the exam. So I figured I would start by talking about how the exam is scored, because I know that's a question that a lot of my students have lately is how do we know if we're on track? And since for most students, AP Lang is a year-long class, we're at basically the halfway point. So we want to know, like, okay, am I on track to get the certain score that I want? And so most students are shooting for at least a 3 composite. Many students are shooting for a 4 or a 5. So let's talk about what that actually means for AP Lang, so that way you can know, yes, I'm on track, or no, I'm not. So basically, one of the ways that you know you're on track could be through progress checks. So if your AP Lang teacher has assigned progress checks on AP Classroom, those are the ones where the number of questions varies, but at least on the teacher side, it gives you like a color coded thing. Like it'll be like dark green, light green, like a dark yellow and light yellow, orange, that kind of thing. Usually when students are at like approximately 50%, if they're in the green, like we're on track. And there's 9 progress checks. So if you happen to like drop into the yellow at some point, like don't stress about it. But basically what I saw for the past couple years is my students who consistently scored in like the really dark green, like I think it's like 80% or something. Those are my students who got a 5. My students who were like dark green and light green on these AP Lang progress checks on AP Classroom, those are my students who got a 4. And then my students who were primarily like the light green maybe got 3s, and that kind of thing. So if your teacher gives you the opportunity to take an AP Lang progress check, take those seriously. If you don't do those in class, that's fine. You can still figure out if you're on track in other ways. So here's the thing about the AP Lang exam. You're going to get a composite score. It's going to be 1 through 5. And this is for all AP tests. That's the score that goes to colleges. So a lot of times what students do is they wait until they get their scores and they decide if they want to send it. You can usually send like one set of scores each year for free. They talk about that when it gets closer to the test. So for my students that are pretty sure they're going to get the score they want on the exam and they know exactly where they want to apply to college, I usually encourage them to just send their scores. But that's something that you might want to consider as well. So the college is going to see the 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Now, depending on which colleges you're applying to, they might take a 3. Some of the colleges where I am, they only accept like 4s and 5s. The really prestigious schools are the ones that only take 5s. But also some schools will take AP Lang credit for like College English 1 and 2. And then other colleges will only take it for College English 1 and they count AP Lit for College English 2. Or they call it like Comp 1, Comp 2. So look into the colleges that you're considering applying to and figure out what score you need. And now let's talk about how you get there. So it involves a little bit of math, right? But the first thing we're going to do is the easy part, figuring out your multiple choice subscore. So what you do is you have 45 questions. It's 45% of your composite. So each question is worth 1 point. That's why on exam day, you want to answer every question. Even if it's a guess, if time is running out, just pick a letter and bubble in because you could be right. Okay. So let's say you answered 30 questions correctly. Well, you're going to give yourself 30 points. And then let's say that now we move on to the essays. There's 2 ways to do this. Usually when I do it with my students, I have them break it up like each essay. So they get a score out of 6. Let's say they get a 4. They're going to take that number 4 and they're going to multiply it by 3.0556 and they're going to get a number. And then they're going to do that for their other essays as well. And so then we add it up and then we add it to their multiple choice and then we round and then we get another number. And then here's the breakdown. And I do have like a video that I just posted on YouTube that goes into more detail about this. But basically, if your number is between 0 and 35 points, you make a 1. 36 to 51 points is a 2. 52 to 62 points is a 3. 63 to 72 points is a 4, and 73 to 100 points is a 5. So the ranges get smaller the higher you get. But if you think about it and you only have to get approximately 52 points to get a 3, if you answer 27 multiple choice questions, right, that's 27 of the 52 points right there. And then we're going to take each of your essay scores and multiply it by 3.0556. That's kind of a weird number. And basically, that helps you figure out your score. So it's important to kind of figure out now, kind of like do like a mock practice and play in with some numbers. There are some online calculators like Albert.io, I think has one. And I think Marco Learning has one too. I have found those to be pretty accurate. So if you're like, Coach Hall, I don't want to do any of that math. I don't know what you just said. Go check those online calculators as well. I like to have my students figure out like best and worst case scenario. So let's say on one essay, they got like a 3 out of 6, but then the next essay, they got a 5 out of 6. We run the numbers with both of those so we can figure out, okay, this is like your worst case scenario. And then this is your best case scenario. So we know, okay, maybe on your worst day, we're looking at like a 3 composite, but on your best day, maybe it's a 4 or something like that. So that's just a way to tell you if you're on track right now. Because a lot of times students ask me like, how do I get a 4? Or how do I get a 5? And there's sort of 2 ways to answer this. Like mathematically, I can tell you how many points you need, and I can tell you how to figure that out because we just talked about that. But then also like what you need to do to get those points. If you're wanting 4s and 5s for composite scores, then we want as many multiple choice questions correctly as possible. And we want like for a 4, 4s and 5s on your essays. If you're shooting for a 5 composite, obviously as many multiple choice correct as you can. And usually consistent 5 out of 6 on the essays should do it. So that's just kind of to give you an idea of like where you want to be. But keep in mind that it's only January. I've seen students improve tremendously from the January to May mark, mostly because like the skills start to click. So don't think that if you run your numbers now and you're like, oh, I'm going to make a 2, like don't think it's like a guaranteed thing. Also, the other side of that is true. I've had students like do their numbers and they're like, oh, I'm definitely gonna get a 5. And it's like, no, don't get too conceited yet. Like don't think you have to stop working. So anyway, if you're curious about how to get a certain score on your AP test, that's kind of the gist of how they do the numbers. I've been asked before, does the College Board curve the test? And like there's a lot of mathematical stuff that we don't know about that goes behind the scenes. But in general, there is a way to figure out, okay, this is what your score would be. I don't think I'm on track. My class has done like 2 multiple choice practices last semester. Plus, my teacher said we should aim for 50% accuracy. Okay, so the 50% accuracy thing is like sort of true. So don't stress about that because you want to be getting. I tell my students like half plus 1, so 45. I tell them to be getting at least 23 out of 45 right. Does that always happen? No. But that's their goal for like this point in the year. I want them to, if they have 45 questions, I want them to be getting 23 right. Now, it also depends on the student. Like I have some students that a 75% is terrible for them. I have other students who on an AP Lang multiple choice would love a 75%. So it just really depends on like your individual scores, I guess, too, and what you consider good. But like students are not expected to make 100 on these multiple choice tests. It is super rare. I think the best score I ever had a student do was 44 out of 45. And that was pretty rare. So you're not expected to be perfect. So yes, 50% is a good score, but I don't want to say it's a good score. It's like a good target score for right now if you're shooting for a 3 composite. I usually feel more comfortable when my students are in like the 55 to 60% range because like if the goal is about 50% or a little higher and they're right at 50%, like I always get a tiny bit, not nervous, but like my next step for them is to shoot for like 60%. So if you're getting around 50%, shoot for 60. Just keep pushing yourself a little bit more. That's all it is. But yeah, the essays are also weighted more. And that's where I think people need to really understand the rubrics, because I think it can be pretty easy to score like a 1, 2, 0 or a 3 out of 6 on your essays. Like you could not even write a full essay and still technically get that score. So if you can understand the rubrics and know how to secure that 4 out of 6 each time, or maybe even more, maybe a 5 out of 6, that's going to help your score as well. So like multiple choice, we definitely don't want to leave any blank. We want to prioritize the questions that we can answer well. Some students do a lot better with the writing questions, which are the ones at the end of the test. Those are like the editing ones. So basically you have 2 reading passages, and they're longer, and sometimes they're super boring and they have more questions. And then you have 3 shorter writing passages. So if you have an hour to answer these questions, it's not necessarily a 50-50 split. My students tend to spend about, like, if they spend the whole hour working, they spend closer to like 35 minutes on the reading and maybe 25 on the writing. I also have some students who, our strategy right now, because they're a lot better at writing than the reading multiple choice, is they flip straight to that third passage and they spend whatever time they need on the writing, and then they go to the reading. Because they're trying to, it's like a game. Like I used to not realize this when I was in high school, but standardized testing is a game. So you're literally trying to earn as many points as possible. So if that means making a guess and moving on, that's what you got to do. If that means not answering the questions in order, that's what you got to do. Different things work for different people. Yeah, so if you're just joining, feel free to post your questions in the chat. Let's see what we got. A question over here on YouTube. Tips on getting the sophistication point for argumentative. Okay, so here's the thing, like sophistication point for argumentative can be a little bit tricky. I think what I would look into is like a nuanced argument. You could also work on your writing style. I feel like that one's kind of hard to work on. And then kind of like that broader context as well. What I like to do with my students who are trying for that sophistication point is I like to have them look at previous year's samples that did earn it, and then look at what did that student do. Not that you could just like copy it, but like I found that especially for students who are visual learners, they're like, oh, okay, this is what the kid did that was sophisticated throughout their paper. This is how I can make this fit my writing style or this prompt, that kind of thing. But I think for argument, learning how to craft a nuanced argument is something that could possibly help. It's also tricky though. Okay, awesome. So let's see what questions we have over here on TikTok. Is it fine that my class hasn't begun covering rhetorical analysis and argument yet? We've only practiced synthesis and MCQ. Technically, yes. So each teacher is different. I would assume that you're going to start covering rhetorical analysis and argument soon. Argument is going to be very similar to synthesis. So for me, I teach rhetorical analysis first because most of my students find that the hardest. It's also my favorite. If you are looking for rhetorical analysis videos, I have a playlist on my YouTube channel with a ton of videos if you ever need help. And I try to do a lot of stuff on TikTok too. So anyway, I start with rhetorical analysis. Some teachers start with synthesis or argument instead. So I spend a decent amount of time on rhetorical analysis and synthesis in the first semester. My students are now doing argument, but I have that as like my shortest one of the 3 because synthesis and argument are really closely linked. Basically, an argument essay is like a synthesis. You just don't have actual sources provided. So it's possible that because you spent a lot of time on synthesis, that maybe you'll do argument and maybe it'll go faster. And then maybe your teacher will do rhetorical analysis before the test. Some teachers do it that way because that one's the hardest. Because I find it the hardest, I start with that first and then we come back to it. But that's just me. So there's no right or wrong way to like structure the class as long as you're covering those topics. But I would assume if you understand synthesis as far as like how to argue, hopefully that will translate to your argument essays. And then if you understand how to argue when you start reading rhetorical analysis, then you'll pick up on the author's argument, hopefully. But rhetorical analysis is kind of the outlier. Like that one is very different than the other 2 essays, in my opinion. But if you've been doing multiple choice, you might already have a little head start on some of those skills. Okay, so tips for rhetorical analysis. Okay, so here's some of the things that students struggle with. Number 1 is identifying rhetorical choices. Remember that a rhetorical choice is just what the writer's doing. So as you're reading, take notes in the side. If you notice repetition, comparison, contrast, detail, an anecdote, just kind of write the word or something in the margin. Because honestly, the margins they give you all are super tiny. Like on the side, it's like really tiny. Underline if you need to, things like that. You can't use a highlighter on the test. I wish you could, but you can't. So start there. What I tell my students to do is to divide the passage chronologically. So for most passages, it's either like first half, second half, or like beginning, middle, and end, depending on like where they see a shift. It could be a shift in topic or tone or choice. And so I tell them, figure out what the writer is doing in the beginning, middle, and end. Because a lot of times students students identify choices that like maybe aren't going to make it into the essay. An example of this is I was doing a passage, it's called the Louvre prompt. It's about like the last child in the woods. I was doing this with my 10th graders this week. And they noticed that at one point he poses a question or two questions. And so we noted that and we talked about why he poses those questions. But like overall, are they going to be able to write a whole paragraph about the questions? Probably not. But when I said, okay, what is he doing in like this last portion of his, it wasn't a speech, it was like a book, like his excerpt. It was more broad. It was like he was trying to, he was like listing details and like reminiscing on the past in order to get his audience to think about the implications for the future. So if you ask yourself, what is the writer doing? And really focus on strong verbs, that's going to help your essay. But just know that like not every single choice that you identify needs to necessarily make it into your essay. Analyze chronologically. So when you write your essay, start at what they're saying in the beginning, middle, end, or first half, second half. It's really disjointed, like when students say like in the first paragraph and then like in the third paragraph and then in the second paragraph, like it feels really out of order. So follow the author's line of reasoning. That's like their order, and that will help your essay. Something else that will really help for rhetorical analysis is understanding why we use acronyms like SpaceCat and Soapstone. There's something called the rhetorical situation. And if you have heard of SpaceCat, it stands for speaker, purpose, audience, context, exigence. If you use Soapstone in your class, the SOAP part, so speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, that's a rhetorical situation, same thing. A lot of times students will include this in their intro and they'll be like, oh, in so-and-so's speech to this group of people and that kind of thing. But then they like never do anything with that information. And that's why a lot of essays, I think, fall flat, is because you have to connect at least one choice to the message, argument, or purpose in rhetorical analysis. And if you're trying to have like deeper analysis, you really need to think about that rhetorical situation. So here are some things you should be asking yourself. Number one is like, what is the speaker's relationship with the audience? So is it an amicable, like friendly relationship? Because if you're talking to somebody that you like and they like you, you make certain choices. But if you know that they're reluctant or hostile, you're going to make different choices. Or if you know more info than them and you're trying to inform them, you're probably going to make different choices. So what's the speaker and audience relationship? Sometimes it's a very personal one. What are the speaker's credentials and why is this person the right one to be giving the speech or writing the letter? Because if it's the president speaking, then chances are there's a reason why he's giving that speech. Also the audience, like what do they have in common? And then also what are their needs, beliefs, or values? So that's one of the questions I ask my students all the time is like, what does this speaker believe or value? And then what does the audience believe or value? Because oftentimes if they share values, that's going to influence the speech as well. And so you can incorporate this knowledge into your essay. I give my students some like sentence frames and stuff that they can use to basically take those questions that I just talked about and kind of work it into their analysis. I have included this information in a couple different YouTube videos. So if you look up like Coach Hall writes rhetorical situation or Coach Hall writes, I think there's a separate SpaceCat video from like 2 years ago that I have been meaning to like modernize. The information is in those videos. And also the video that I released, I think it was like late last night. It took me forever to edit. There's like one section on it where it's like rhetorical analysis. The video is all about how to pass the AP Lang test, but there's one part in the rhetorical analysis where there's a slide of some of those questions too. So if you're like, hey, I want more info about that, that is where I have that. And I'd be happy to answer those questions in like separate TikTok videos too. Let's see. what should commentary mainly focus on for synthesis or argumentative essays? Okay, that's a great question because I feel like with rhetorical analysis, it's really easy for us to say, like, okay, focus on these things like message, argument, purpose. Synthesis and argument, first of all, we got to understand what commentary is. Commentary is explaining the significance of the evidence, which is sort of a helpful definition and sort of not. But on the AP Lang exam, if you see like bullet points on the paper about like explain the significance of the evidence, that's the College Board's way of saying commentary. So it's your analysis. So here's what people do that's sort of wrong. They just kind of, especially for synthesis, they will just restate what the evidence said. So like they'll quote something and then they'll just like their commentary is them rephrasing it. Like this means that blah 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 and it's like literally the same thing. Try not to do that. So what should you do instead? Really think about like the implications of the evidence or the example that you gave. So instead of using the word shows, try words like illustrates, highlights, conveys, demonstrates, emphasizes. A fancy word for emphasizes is underscores, means the same thing. So those are words that I literally have like a word wall in my classroom, and I include those words in a lot of my videos because having to include those words in your commentary helps you at least write commentary. And as long as you have commentary consistently after each piece of evidence, you are hopefully going to increase your score. So that's the other thing is make sure your commentary is consistent. So you want evidence, then commentary. You don't want this like huge chunk of evidence and then a little bit of commentary. You want a little bit of evidence, like an appropriate amount, and then more commentary. And then ideally more evidence and more commentary. Kind of like layer it. So let's see. Is it recommended to get the Princeton review book for AP Lang? That's a good question. And someone on YouTube just asked about the best prep book. I'm looking into the Princeton one because I normally like Princeton I've used their ACT books with my students in the past. So I normally like Princeton. The one that I didn't like last year for AP Lang was, well, okay. I was not convinced that Kaplan was going to be the best prep book for the student I was working with. We wanted to pursue a different option, trying to be like diplomatic there, but but I normally do like Princeton Review. There's also the 5 Steps to a 5 used to be really good, but I need to get like their most recent copy because before they changed the test, like it did have some good stuff. Something else that's really helpful is if you're instead of buying a test prep book, I would honestly look into the ultimate review packet from the like Tim from the Garden of English does it. And you can usually, I think you can get like the first unit for free or like there's a whole thing with that. So he does a really good job with that. If you don't already follow Garden of English, he has some great videos as well. He does a lot more, like Tim's a good friend of mine and we collaborate a lot. He does a lot more like tech in his videos. And he and I are actually going to be teaming up throughout the spring to do different stuff for students to prepare for the exam as well. So I would say Princeton Review, if you can look at it before you purchase it and just make sure that it looks like what the exam looks like, I would say Princeton Review is usually the best one. Let me see if I can like look up one right now. Let me see, because the one I used last year, or like I had a student use last year, was Kaplan, and it like stressed that student out unnecessarily. I did not like that particular book for last year's edition. Maybe they improved it. All right, let's see what Princeton Review looks like, because I normally really do like them. But I also don't think students need to buy prep books. That's kind of why I do what I do is like, I feel like everybody deserves like free access to information and, or at least like the opportunity for it. I'm not saying that I don't, tutor when asked, but I feel like, you deserve to have like quality YouTube videos and other things for free to supplement what you're doing. All right. So I'm looking at their practice test right now. This will be a good indicator of the quality. So let's look at a couple of these questions. Okay. The questions look pretty solid. Um, so I would say Princeton. Here's the thing: is I would say if you are looking for extra practice, the Princeton one looks like it could be pretty good. Um, but with test prep companies, because it's like them trying to mimic the College Board, I feel like there's a little bit more variation in scores. Let's see their synthesis essay, because this will be the real test. Develops your position. Okay, so they're using the correct language. Okay. Yeah, for those that were asking about the Princeton one, if you want to spend money on a test prep book, that would be one that I think you could use. I don't have any contacts with Princeton Review, but I like their stuff. So yeah. All right. Any other questions? Feel free to type your questions in the chat. It could be anything like AP Lang related, exam related. What is the difference between persuasive and argumentative? Yeah, this is where it gets a little confusing. I think partially because, like, in younger grades, they teach persuasive writing and then they switch to argumentative a lot of the time. So I I don't know. I don't necessarily focus on persuasive writing. I focus on argumentative where so arguing like argumentative, you are trying to argue your point. You're trying to prove your point. Um and if you persuade the reader in the process, that's great, but I feel like persuasive essays um it's not so much asserting a position, you're trying to, like, convince someone to, like, buy something or do something, whereas an argument essay, you're just saying, like, "Okay, this is the position I'm taking, and here's why. Here's why it's accurate." So, like, some of the ways that you present things varies between persuasion and argument, but I also think they overlap a little bit. Is Barron's a good test prep book? Ooh, I forgot about Barron's. Let's see. I've used Barron's, let's see. I've used it for I think like ACT or SAT. Barron's AP Lang 2023. Normally Barron's is pretty good. Let's look at their book. I'm just scoping it out on Amazon. Sorry, y'all. Trying to like have my phone propped up and I'm trying to like see the screen as well. But normally Barron's is pretty good. The thing is they want to produce a good quality textbook because they want people to buy it. So like it is in their best interest to make a quality book. It's not letting me view it though. Let's see. Yeah, it's for whatever reason I can't like see inside it on Amazon the way I did for the other one. Hmm. But I can tell you that I've liked their stuff in the past, but for whatever reason, it's not letting me like see some of the samples. So I can't totally tell you. Sorry about that. But yeah, normally it's pretty decent. What do you recommend doing to stop using how in commentary? Okay, what do you mean by that? Because that's a good question. Because so, like commentary can be like answering the question of how. So what do you mean by that? Because I'm intrigued by this question. So could you maybe give me an example of like a sentence that you would try to take the word how out, if that's what you're saying, and then I can maybe help you there. All right, let's see. For a student reaching to make a 3, what is the target multiple choice? Oh, okay. So if you're just joining, we actually talked about this a little bit earlier. If you're trying to make a 3, you want approximately 55 to 60% on your multiple choice plus 4 out of 6s on your essays. Here's why. If you get like 23 out of 45 questions on your multiple choice and 4 out of 6 on your essay, you should get like the lower end of a 3 composite. I think it's pinned on TikTok, a video explaining the breakdown of things and like how they calculate scores to the best of our knowledge, because there's certain things that the College Board doesn't tell us. And if you watch the beginning of the video I just posted on YouTube last night, how to pass the AP Lang exam in 2023, kind of a clickbaity title, I know. In the beginning, I explained like the breakdown of the test and how you can calculate your score. So if you want to watch that, it's a long video, gives lots of tips, but in the beginning, it talks about that. The other thing is there are online score calculators. I think Albert IO has one, and I think Marco Learning has one, and you can like plug in your numbers and do it that way. And I think those are pretty accurate. Like I tested it out and tried to do like a trial run, and it matched with the method that I use. So basically, what I do for my students is for each multiple choice question they get right, it's 1 point. So if they answer 28 questions right, they get 28 points. Then I take each of their essay scores. So let's say they make a 4 out of 6, and I multiply that by 3.0556. And so we have their multiple choice, we have their 3 different essay scores, add that all up, then we round, and then there's like a breakdown. It's probably going to be backwards on y'all's screen. Yeah, it's not mirrored. But basically, if you make between 0 and 35 points, it's a 1. Between 36 and 51 points, it's a 2. 52 to 62 is a 3. 63 to 72 is a 4. And 73 to 100 is a 5. So basically, if you are trying to get a 3, you want to be trying to get like maybe 55 total points. And that's how you can figure out if you're doing it. But for multiple choice, I would say at least right now at this point in the year, try for at least 23 out of 45. But obviously, the more the better. And some tests are a little bit harder than others. There are 3 full tests on AP Classroom, and my students tend to score really well on 1 and 3, and then their scores tend to drop. Not everybody's, but some people's scores drop a little bit on test 2. And so what we do is we kind of run scenarios with like, this is your best score that you've gotten, this is your worst score. Let's see what the numbers say. So don't be super stressed out if like you go down a couple points one time or up a couple points. I know it's hard to like not stress about those things, but sometimes the test is a tiny bit harder, or maybe you just didn't connect with that passage or something. But the College Board also kind of deals with all that stuff on the back end too. Not sure if you're doing this, but is it possible you could look over the previous Obama FRQ? Do you mean like look at a student's answer, or do you mean just like talk about that particular FRQ now? I actually really like that prompt. So if people have questions about it, I'd be happy to answer. So just let me know what you're looking for. If you want like tips for addressing it or something more specific. All right. So yeah, feel free to ask more questions in the chat. I need to figure out if I can do this, but I would love to kind of do one of these like sessions where I can like flip my screen and like show you all, like read through an essay and like comment on it. But I'd have to kind of figure out how to set that up. But I'm going to be going live each Sunday. So right around like 3 p.m. Eastern time, I'm going to go live on TikTok and YouTube and answer student questions. So if you're interested in joining in, please make sure you're following on TikTok and YouTube. And if you're on TikTok, do me a favor and hit that screen. We've only got 8 likes so far. So give me a couple likes if you don't mind. Just like you can actually like hit your screen a bunch of times. I figured that out the other day. What's more important, having more evidence and less analysis, or the other way around? Oh, definitely the other way around. You need evidence. Like it does need to be specific, but like you don't want a ton of evidence and then a little bit of commentary. You want an appropriate amount of evidence. You have to be specific, but you want to aim for more commentary than evidence. So that's because that's really what they're looking for, especially when you're trying to get like a 3 and a 4 on the like row B of the rubric. A 2 is going to be like your commentary is kind of simplistic or repetitive. Like it's an attempt, but it's not really doing anything. If you make 1 point well, like literally if you have like one solid body paragraph with good commentary, you address the prompt, you accomplish what you're supposed to accomplish, you can make a 3 out of 4. If you do it consistently, that's where you get the 4 out of 4. So you always want to make sure that you're proving your claim with evidence, but definitely the commentary. I've heard some teachers say that they tell their students to do like 4 sentences of commentary for 1 sentence of evidence. I think that's really hard, if I'm being honest. I tell my students like at least a 1-to-2 ratio, or better yet, 1-to-3 if they can. Because like you can put evidence and commentary in the same sentence technically. So make sure you have 1 or 2 sentences of commentary after your evidence. 2 is better. How can we improve our MCQ scores? Okay, great question. So first of all, what I would say is figure out what your strengths are. Are you better at the reading questions or the writing questions? And then from there, if you are better at the writing questions, How is your overall pacing? Because the reading questions comes first. Those are like the comprehension ones. And then the writing questions are kind of like editing. So what I tell my students to do is look at your sub scores. Are you better at the reading or the writing? And then look at like which questions you're good at, because you want to possibly prioritize those. Like if you know that you're really good at like for the reading, like those words and context questions, when it's like, what does this word in line 55 mean? If you're running out of time, definitely answer a question like that as opposed to like, what is the meaning of the passage as a whole? Anytime you can answer questions that deal with like a specific portion of the passage, like a certain word, which for those, please read the surrounding sentences. Like if it says, what does this word in line 55 mean? Don't just go to line 55. Read the surrounding sentences, because usually there's a context clue. And so what I've noticed is students sometimes get it wrong when they only read the line with the word or just the sentence. You need to read the surrounding sentences too, and you're more likely to get it right. But if you're good at those, or like it's easier to answer ones like, what is the primary function of the first paragraph, or what is the main idea of the first paragraph? Those are usually easier for students than the ones about the whole passage. So especially if you're running out of time, prioritize those. But I would say figure out the questions that you do well so you know how to play to your strengths. I would also look for trends. So if you notice that like every time they ask a certain question, you're like most likely going to get it wrong, then you need to know that so you can start to study questions like that. And you can actually use ACT and SAT tests to practice too, because a lot of the skills overlap. Not all of them, but some of the skills overlap. So my students who struggle with like a certain type of question, we practice that one because it's kind of like you want to practice the things that you're kind of weaker at. And so we do that as well. So that would be like my best advice for the multiple choice is figure out which section you're better at. Some students are equally good at both, but I've had some students be a lot better at the writing. And so we want to make sure that you're not running out of time for those questions. Cause like I had a student who would average about like 90% of the writing questions right, but that student spent so long on the reading that they only got through half the writing questions. And it was like, whoa, like you're super accurate with the writing. Like just you can, at least on the paper test, you can start with those. And then if you're not so great at the reading ones, like you might get them wrong anyway. Like focus on the ones you can do well. The other thing is to remember that multiple choice is 1 point each. So like you don't want to linger too long on any one particular question, because you might be able to come back to it. That was something that was really hard for me as a high school student, is to realize that like it's okay to just guess and move on sometimes and come back to it. Like I wanted to be confident, but then I would maybe shortchange myself time later. So those are just some tips for the multiple choice, and then like really understanding what the questions are asking too. So like brushing up on like things like transition words, and knowing how to understand the main idea, knowing how to eliminate answers. I think that's one of the biggest things is students get stuck between two answers. And so if you have the opportunity to take a practice test, whether it's like an AP one or ACT, SAT, always go look at the right answer and then try to ask yourself if you got it wrong. Okay, why is this right answer right? Because sometimes students just say like, oh, the answer was D and I put A. Well, that's not going to help you learn. So I do it in class where like students will discuss it together, and maybe like learn from each other. Like sometimes as a teacher, like my students explain it to each other better than I can. So like if you know that somebody else in your class got the answer right and you got it wrong, ask them like, hey, how did you know? And try to find like a specific part in the text that proves that answer, because that will help you get better next time. If you just look at the right answer and you're like, oh, it was D, then you're not learning anything. That's why teachers sometimes have you all write like this answer is right because, this answer is wrong because, but sometimes those get tedious, but that's why we do it. I always get the author's argument wrong in my thesis. Is this for rhetorical analysis? Okay, so here's the thing. So for rhetorical analysis, you're going to be asked about either the message, argument, or purpose. So honestly, of those three, I've seen argument the least. I've seen a lot, at least more recently, I've seen a lot more of message or purpose in the prompt. So here's the thing. All passages are going to have a purpose. So if in your thesis, if you say the author does this and this, whatever the choices are, two, and then you tell us like why they do it, then you should be getting the point. But as far as determining what the argument is, like we were doing one in class with my students. It said something about like develops the author's argument about what was it, like people and nature or something. So like they gave you a clue as to what the passage was about, but like they didn't tell you what the argument actually was. So that after my students read it, that was my first question, is like, okay, what is this guy arguing? And then the students were able to tell me. The other thing is I have my students try to phrase it differently throughout their essay, kind of use like synonyms and that kind of thing. So ask yourself, okay, usually if you're arguing something, you're either for it or against it. Now, it's not always that clear cut, but ask yourself, like, what are they actually saying about this topic? And maybe start there. What is the topic? And then like, how do they feel about it? Like, what are they arguing for or against? What are they really saying? And you should be able to find like evidence of that in the passage as well. Okay. All right, let's see. Favorite synthesis prompts to teach. Okay, so there's a couple different types of synthesis prompts. Excuse me. I used to really like to teach like the factors ones, and they have since changed their phrasing to say like develop a position on. But it's possible they could say develop a position on the factors that whatever. So I still teach two factors ones just in case, because I just try to make sure my students are as prepared as possible. So for factors, I like the locavore prompt. It's about like eating locally grown food. And then I like wind farms. And I teach locavore first and then wind farms, because wind farms is a little bit harder because my students have zero reference for a wind farm. They could care less. So I like that prompt. And I tell them, hey, this prompt is probably something that you have never thought of. But here's how we use the sources to help you form an argument. So I like to give them a couple of prompts where I know they're not going to be familiar with the topic, because I want them to have that experience of like, here's what I do. I tell them to go to the sources and figure out, based on what the sources say, what could they convincingly argue. As far as like other prompts that say like develop a position on something, I try to do like the most current ones. So there's like STEM education, cursive writing. My students haven't loved those, but we at least were able to talk about, that broader context of like why that matters. There's one, for the teachers that might be watching, there's one on AP Classroom about kindergarten, and my students actually liked that one. And I added a couple different sources to it, at least one. I added one source to it that they liked. So if you're a teacher and you want more info about that, feel free to reach out to me and I could tell you what it is. Tips for on-demand writing. Okay, here's the thing. So timed essays, and this goes for all 3 timed essays. Number 1, you do not need a long introduction, because honestly, we just look for the thesis point. Now, if you are writing a research paper for school and you have like 3 weeks to do it, you shouldn't probably have that short of an intro, I guess. But like if you have 40 minutes to write an essay, a sentence or 2 plus your thesis is usually fine. Prioritize your body paragraphs. You should have at least 2 body paragraphs if possible. Some students go for 3. I prefer quality over quantity. And honestly, the more I've taught AP Lang, the more I see my students just doing a 2 body paragraph thing and not 3. They just don't have the time. They don't have the time to develop their 3 full paragraphs the way they want to. In most cases. Are there exceptions? Yes. But most of my students do 2 body paragraphs. Conclusions are nice, but not necessary. If you are worried that your thesis was not defensible the first time, then definitely try to restructure it in your conclusion. But if you have time for a conclusion, rather than just like summarizing what you just wrote, instead try to like situate the issue in a broader context. So for rhetorical analysis, ask yourself questions like, what is the historical impact of this passage, if there is one? Or how is this message or argument still relevant today, and kind of situate it in like a more modern context in your conclusion. I do have a video about that on YouTube if you want more info about rhetorical analysis conclusions, but like so often we see like a 1-sentence conclusion that just summarizes the paper, and that always feels kind of because it's like I just read those points. Also, do not stress about a conclusion. Like if you literally do not have time to write one, focus on your body paragraphs instead. To help your writing with body paragraphs, really understand that you need a topic sentence, which is going to be your claim. It's going to basically say the idea that you're introducing. And there's different ways to write those. Include evidence, be as specific as possible with that evidence, like direct quotes if it's synthesis or rhetorical analysis, or you can paraphrase it. For argument, make sure it's a very specific example, not just something general. Like saying World War II is super general. And then make sure you have plenty of commentary to follow that evidence. And if you like to layer it, then do that. And I encourage my students to write a concluding sentence to basically like tie it back to their main idea or their thesis. Like kind of, even though you think you've proven your point, it really helps your tired teachers and readers if you like wrap up your paragraph and are like, therefore, and then like connect it back. Because there have been so many times where a student hasn't had a concluding sentence and I had to like go back and reread the paragraph because I forgot what they were talking about. And that might also reflect their writing. But when students have that concluding sentence, it's like, oh yeah, yep, you just proved your thesis. I'm on board. Got it. Like that kind of thing. So that's kind of like the general structure that I would say that you need to follow. And I would also say, like, for timed essays, like, I guess, like, really focus on the body paragraphs. That's probably my best advice. Short intro, conclusions are nice, but they're not mandatory. I cannot tell you how many essays I've read that don't have a conclusion and they still scored fine. Let's see what we got on TikTok. What is the best way to practice essays if you don't do a lot of them in class? Okay, great question. So, I hope teachers don't hate me for telling you all this, but it's public info you can find yourselves. The College Board posts its old exams online, the prompts. So what I would do if I was a student who wanted more writing practice is first I would talk to your teacher, because you don't want to accidentally stumble upon a prompt that your teacher was going to use. So I would maybe say, could you recommend some prompts that we're not doing in class that I could write on my own? If you're not comfortable with that you can just look up some online, but like maybe give your teacher a little heads up that you want some extra practice. Because I had a student do that. One of my students did not do very well on a multiple choice, and she was like, hey, I don't want to make extra work for you, but can you give me some stuff? I will do it on my own. But could you please help me? I just need resources. And I was like, sure, absolutely. Because as teachers, I think we like it when you all want to do a little extra. So ask your teacher if there's prompts they can recommend. That way you're not like inadvertently finding something that you're going to be doing later on. But I would look up exam prompts. I would keep it pretty current. Please know that the College Board changed their wording a couple years ago. So you're going to want to look at stuff that's a little bit more current, but a lot of teachers also use those current prompts. So that's why I talk to your teacher. And I would look at those prompts as well. I have a couple of videos. If you want something that your teacher probably isn't going to use or might not use, if you go on YouTube and type in class with Coach Hall, I have a couple of videos. It's like a video series. I think I have one or two for rhetorical analysis and one or two for argument. And I take people through the lessons that I give my students, sort of. And I usually try to link the handouts in the description. And those are like inspired by College Board prompts, but they're not actually College Board prompts. And you can just take that and like write your own essay if you want to. So if you want that, type in class with Coach Hall on YouTube and it'll come up. I want to do more of those. So if y'all find stuff like that helpful, please let me know so I can plan more content around that as well. But definitely look up prompts that have been used on like recent exams, like 2010. I wouldn't go earlier than 2010. Some of those prompts are like, they've changed the test. Do you have suggestions for how to do a rhetorical analysis thesis? I have trouble not putting in the devices. Okay, so yes, I have a sentence frame that I give my students. When you say not putting in the devices, do you mean the nouns? Like, because some teachers really, and I agree with this, I don't like my students to say like the writer uses repetition. I don't have a problem with it if the student says the writer repeats, for instance, like patriotic diction, or the writer repeats inclusive diction, or whatever it is. I don't mind if you say repeats. I tell my students to try not to use the word uses. Now, under pressure, if that's all you can think of, you'll still get the point. So just do the best you can. Yes, like that. Okay, so just really focus on your verbs. Really focus on just those rhetorically accurate verbs. So a lot of the nouns can be turned into a verb. So for instance, let's say you want to write about comparison, just say compares. If you want to write about contrast, just say contrast or juxtaposes. My 10th graders did a passage recently with an anecdote. You cannot turn anecdote into a verb, but what you can do is you can say like reminisces on or recalls a time when or what was the other one? Tells a story about. So you can kind of take whatever noun it is and you can kind of turn it into a verb. So that would be something. What are the best devices to use? Um, whatever's in there. Here are some of the ones that are more common, but don't project this onto your passage, meaning like I in my class a couple years ago, we did a lot with like contrast. Like I just happened to choose passages that had contrast. We were talking about it in class. I gave my students an essay one time to write, and they were like looking at the passage, and one student was like, "Hey, Coach Hall, I don't see any contrast in here. Like there's no juxtaposition." And I was like, "Why are you looking for that?" And he was like, "Well, because we always do." And I was like, "Oh shoot." Okay, so we had to take a minute and be like, "Hey, just because we talk about it in previous classes does not mean this is in every prompt." So here are some of the ones that are common. But again, they're not in everything. Um, Comparison or contrast. So are they trying to highlight the similarities or the differences? Because a lot of people group those together, but like, are they trying to highlight the similarities? If so, compare. If they're trying to highlight the differences, contrast. All passages have word choice. So if you get a passage and you're like, I don't know where to start, like my students asked me a while ago, like, what is the worst case scenario? Like if we get a passage and we don't understand it, what do we do? Word choice and tone. Like now, like because word choice creates tone. So look at their word choice. Something else that's really common is repetition. Are they posing questions? That's common, but students can't always write about that. So that's one where you might see it, but maybe it doesn't make it into your essay. Details. So usually when it's like poetry and stuff, we call it imagery. But I tend to tell my students to talk about like the author describes this or the author details this instead of saying imagery because imagery is a noun. So logos, ethos, pathos are appeals. So remember, choices create appeals. So like for instance, if you notice that something's logical, instead of saying the writer uses logos, ask yourself, what are they doing to make it logical? Facts and statistics. Certain prompts have a lot of facts and statistics in them. Other prompts might not because it's not relevant. So if you notice that, especially with like an argument, I feel like if they're making an argument, they're probably going to try to be logical. It's probably going to be facts, statistics, or examples. If that's the case, you probably are going to end up writing about those. Word choice can help convey emotion. Anecdotes are common, but like not super common. Like, so not every passage is going to have an anecdote. Not to be confused with an antidote. I've had students write antidote before. That's like the medical thing. Anecdote is Anecdote. Now, if you spell the word wrong, they don't really care on the test, but anecdote. It's like a short story, usually a personal story. Sometimes they're funny. They don't have to be funny though. Any kind of examples are usually worth writing about as well. Also, if the author defines a term, that is a rhetorical choice that they're making. And so that might be worth mentioning in your essay as well. Because if they're going to take time to define it, then you probably might want to address it. So those are some. If you want more tips on that, I have a super old video, not super old, it's from 2020. I remember making this like the day before the test, like staying up until like 2 a.m. So if there's mistakes in that video, I apologize. But I was really trying to help out the class of 2020 with that video. But it's like one of my top videos on YouTube. It's something about like which choices do you need to know for the AP Lang exam. It's on my list to redo it and to like make it updated, but the info still applies. So if you want tips, please check out that video. All right, let's check out some questions on YouTube. Can I still get a 5 without the sophistication point on any of my essays? Yes. And I say this because I know it's true because of how the points can work out. And also we as teachers kind of get a little bit of info on our student exams. And I had, based on the number of students that I think got the sophistication point last year on any of their essays, and like based on the info I have, I had more students get a 5 than the number of sophistication points I think we got. If that makes any sense. So yes, you can get a 5 without the sophistication point. Totally possible because it's not a contingency thing. It's not like, oh, you must get the sophistication point in order to earn a 5. It just goes by how many points. And honestly, for most people, don't worry about sophistication at this point in the year. If you are consistently getting like a 140, then I would say, yeah, start kind of looking into sophistication. But here's the thing about sophistication. So I'm just now starting to cover that with my students a little bit of like, hey, let's try this to make it more sophisticated. When my students do it, it does not mean that they all earn the sophistication point, but usually what happens is their commentary gets better. So there's certain things that I have my students experiment with and like we try to do, and it helps their commentary. So for sophistication, in case people are curious, there's usually 3 ways you can earn it. One is broader context. I think that one's the easiest. It's basically like situating the issue in a broader context, like really thinking about why this issue matters beyond the passage or beyond the sources or beyond the examples that you've given, if it's argument. Deeper thought, basically. But you can't earn sophistication just by like one sentence. It has to be consistent. A lot of students kind of shoot for this in their conclusion if they're kind of trying to make like a more sophisticated conclusion and really situate it in a broader context. Usually that's where I see students starting to attempt it, is that in there. You can also get it because of your writing style. I think this one is harder. I encourage my students to try to, number one, get rid of lower level words. So good, bad, thing, stuff, really get those words out of your writing if you can, and replace them with appropriate synonyms. When you can use higher level words and make it sound natural in your writing, do so. Focus on strong verbs. That's not going to get you the sophistication point, but it will make you a better writer. Active voice, if you know what that is, that usually helps too. I also teach my students how to use dashes, semicolons, colons, and commas to offset extra information correctly, because they need to know this for the ACT, which is our state test, but it also helps their writing. Like, it's going to sound really dumb, but I honestly, like, when I have read a whole bunch of essays and no one's used a colon and then suddenly someone does, I'm like, and they use it correctly, I'm like, oh, that's nice. It doesn't mean they get the sophistication point, but it's like a breath of fresh air. So if you can learn how to use that punctuation correctly and effectively in your essay, it helps your style. And then like there's the whole like nuanced argument or like really connecting to the rhetorical situation that helps with sophistication too. Can sophistication be in the conclusion, not just on a paragraph on its own? So you can, here's the thing that makes sophistication tricky is like it has to be like consistent. But like usually we see like a couple different places in the essay where we see the sophisticated thought or the sophisticated phrasing. It does not have to be in the conclusion, and that's not a requirement. But many students who are practicing for sophistication or attempting it, that's kind of where they start. But just because you have a conclusion doesn't mean you're getting the sophistication point and that kind of thing either. But that's where a lot of students start, is trying to make a strong conclusion. And then like that's kind of like their first step, if that makes sense. But if you don't have a conclusion, but you have really well-written paragraphs, you could still earn the sophistication point. No, my battery is about to die on my phone. Well, I've got like 10% left, so I can answer a few more questions. Can you please give an example of broader context? Yes. Let me think about the best example I could give. Okay, let me give you a historical broader context one, and then I'll try to do something different. Okay, so historical. One of the prompts that it's not an official prompt, a prompt that I made for my students, and I use this in a lot of my videos, is FDR's Pearl Harbor speech. So basically, it's a speech where he's speaking to Congress, asking them to declare war. Well, the broader context is we know that the US went to war. Actually, my students who take APUSH have learned, and we talk about this in my class too, is like Congress voted and everybody but one person voted yes to go to war. The one person who didn't, fun fact, it was Jeanette Rankin. She was also a congressperson for World War I. She voted against it then too, because she was like a lifelong pacifist. So she voted no to both world wars. So info like that's relevant could go in your conclusion. So in your essay, if we're talking about this FDR one, you're going to talk about like maybe how he creates a common enemy because of his repetition and his word choice. And then you might talk about how he calls the audience to action, and there's a patriotic shift. This was all done over radio. So he had to inform the public that it had happened, and then and let them know, let Congress know, and then like, here's what happened. And then there's like, here's what we need to do. That's kind of like the division of his speech, right? So if I had analyzed all that in the body of my essay, then in my conclusion, I might talk about how like We know that FDR's speech was successful because he convinced Congress to almost unanimously um, go to war. And then you could kind of talk about like the implications of that and like World War II. That would be broader context. So basically, like if it's a speech that's or letter or something that's kind of tied to history, ask yourself like about that historical time period. Do you have any relevant info about it? And then like how is the issue relevant today? So now let's talk about the message. So let's use someone had asked about this previously. The Sonia Sotomayor speech. I think someone asked about that one. No, they asked about Rosa Parks. Okay, let me do the Rosa Parks one then. So basically, you could talk about the significance of Rosa Parks historically, but the speech was Obama gave the speech in 2013, and so it was basically like the message was kind of like be like Rosa, that kind of thing. So you could talk about like in the 10 years since Obama gave the speech, here's how people could be like Rosa today, or like here's the progress we've made in being like Rosa since she sat in that seat on the bus, but here's what still needs to be done. And like that could go in your conclusion and it would be broader context, but you'd have to actually be specific. I'm just kind of like ad-libbing it right now, but you could look at like, okay, this is the progress that has happened since the event in the speech or the time that the speech was given, but here's how this issue is still important today. The same thing with the Sotomayor speech. She was talking about identity. I had a couple students do this this essay for me in my sophomore class, and they wrote about like kind of like how the issue of identity matters today and like which groups are still marginalized or like that kind of thing, and how like how America is starting to, she says something in the speech about America is like a salad bowl, like she uses that analogy. And so I had some students kind of analyze that, like here's what we've done to become more like to embrace the salad bowl more and things like that. And they were like pointing to current events and things like that. So that's the broader context. But the reason why I say that's usually good for a conclusion is because it can be helpful analysis, but it's not, it's kind of like separate from or like in addition to the task at hand. Like you must be analyzing rhetorical choices and providing commentary before you start to do this broader context kind of stuff. And that broader context can come up in your actual commentary as well. So hopefully that was helpful. I'm happy to create like more videos about this to break it down and to like show you examples. It's kind of hard on lives to like explain it without like being able to show you what it looks like. But I do have a couple of videos and blog posts on sophistication. So if you want some tips, they are older, but I think the tips still work. And then I'm going to update those videos as well. Sorry, I'm new. What time are you going live? Okay, thank you for asking. It's going to be each Sunday right now around 3 p.m. Eastern time. As the exam gets closer, I'll be doing it much more frequently. But right now I've committed to Sundays at 3 p.m. And I usually stay on for an hour or like I'm past an hour at this point, but just to answer questions. Okay, got it. Thank you so much. Awesome. I'm glad that was helpful. It's really hard to sometimes talk it through, but if you want tips on that, I do have videos that spell it out, and I will make like new videos too. If y'all ever have video requests on TikTok, if it's something that I can answer really quickly, like leave a comment on one of my videos, and I usually try to respond with video because a lot of questions that students have, other students need to ask as well. So if you're not following on TikTok, be sure to follow because I really actually enjoy answering people's questions on there as well. And then like if you have YouTube video ideas, let me know that as well. Do you have any tips for redundancy? Yes, I think like one of the things you could do is if you have something that you've written and you're worried it's redundant, go through and like highlight the possible redundancy. That way you know where to revise. That's also like an ACT skill. I'm smiling because we were talking about that in class this week of like sometimes students try to say things in a way to like add more words to their word count, but like usually shorter is better. So if you're taking the SAT or the ACT and you see that they've like rephrased the question in a bunch or like the wording in a bunch of ways, but it's like the same thought, they're just making it wordier and wordier, choose the shortest answer that still makes sense. It's called concision. An argument essay is what is the best way to connect the evidence? It seems so random and conversational. Okay, so this is where transitions are going to help because I agree with you. So one thing to think about, I hope my battery doesn't die. One thing to think about is what is the best order of your examples? Strike that. What is the best order of your main ideas? Then within your main ideas, what is the best order of your examples? Chronological order. What kinds of transitions can you make? Because if you can focus on transitions between paragraphs, usually with those topic sentences, and then within paragraphs, that's going to make it seem less random. So the transitional phrases really help. And I do have some sentence frames that I use for they can be applied to argument that kind of help connect those ideas. But yeah, the topic sentences where you're like, especially for body paragraph 2, you want to try to like link to the first body paragraph and then introduce your new idea. So something like, in addition to whatever you previously talked about, this topic, whatever you're writing about, is also relevant in new main idea. That's one way. Or having already proven that, and then whatever your first topic was, one must also consider, and then your new topic. Hopefully that makes sense. I have videos on this, and I know I've put it on TikTok somewhat recently, but yeah, those topic sentences can be a great way, but transitions really matter when you're trying to do argument. Should all essays be written in active voice? It's not a requirement, it's a preference. If you write in passive voice, they don't take points off or anything, but it really does help if it's active. I encourage active voice, but like if a student writes a passive sentence, it's not the end of the world. It's one of those things that I literally did not know what active voice was until I got to college. And then I had my very first English professor. She gave me an 88 and I was used to making A's. And I was like, what did I do wrong? And she's like, well, you used the word is 12 times. So I took off 12 points. She was a strict grader. I made a 95 at the end of that semester, and it was the highest grade she had given all semester was a 95. And I was super proud of myself. But let me tell you, when I learned what active voice was, because I kept losing points because I used the word is, that was how I learned. Now, as a teacher, I just try to point it out to my students, but active voice really does help. It just sounds better, but it's not required. So, let's see. How does the online test work? Am I allowed to write essays in a doc? Okay, I am not super familiar with the online test because my students are taking the paper test, but there should be something on the College Board's website that tells you about it, and I will look into that because I know that students have questions as well. Because when they did the online test previously during COVID, there were certain rules that they had that people really did not like. And I think they've changed some of them. So the previous experience is not the same as what you're going to have this year. So I don't want to give you misinformation. So I will look into it and let you know. But you will have a way to write your essay. The other thing is like if you need to plan, I hope they give you scratch paper, but let's say they don't. You can type notes in your doc and then have your essay. And as an AP reader, like if we see stuff that's not the essay, we just don't read it, if that makes sense. Like if a student like is somehow planning their evidence and it's like their outline, it's not their essay, we just don't read it. We only read the essay. Okay, hold on one second. I see your question about multiple choice faster, but I think my phone's about to die. So I will answer that in 1 second. I just want to plug it in here. Okay, it's going to be a little shaky. I apologize because I have to hold it to charge it. Okay, multiple choice faster. Good question. I would say if you want to do multiple choice faster, you have to understand that the passage is boring. You're reading to understand. You're not reading to be entertained. If you zone out a lot, because I used to have to like reread paragraphs and stuff, sometimes it's going to look stupid. But if you mouth the words, it's kind of like it tricks your brain into thinking you're talking, and sometimes it helps your comprehension. Like if you've noticed that you understand better when you read it out loud, that's probably why. So I've had students for like tests and stuff that like be like, and they're like reading it, but like nobody should be looking at you. So if that's what helps, that helps. Tracking your pencil or your finger under the words sounds kind of basic, but it really helps as well to stay focused. Now, as far as like pacing, something that I would encourage you to try for multiple choice and do this with like an SAT test that's online, just as a practice, is like if you don't already do this, try to read the questions first and then read the passage. This does not work for everybody. Some of my students love it. Some of my students hate it. But what I have my students do is I have everybody experiment with it. And what I do is I give them a passage and I say, okay, like let's read the questions. You're not reading the answers. That's going to screw you up. But look at the questions. And so when it says, what is the function of the first paragraph? The benefit to reading the questions first sometimes is that you now know that you have a question about the first paragraph and you can kind of bracket stuff off and things like that. Or when it says like, what is so and so's attitude toward this topic? Like, you know what you're looking for. So that way you can kind of read knowing what to look for and it's more strategic. Now, like I said, that really screws up some people. So I would experiment with it, give it a shot, like download like one of the free SAT or ACT practice tests, find a nonfiction passage. So just not like a literary narrative one. That wouldn't be too bad. It's just that they don't assess fiction on AP Lang. Just choose a passage and just try that technique. See if it helps. Because it's helped some of my students. Is a factor statistic, if a factor statistic is given in a prompt of an argument essay, is it okay to use it in the essay? Yes. I don't know that I've seen that recently, but yes. Oh yeah, any like it's free information or fair use or whatever you want to call it. Like yes, like if they provide the info, you can. Now here's the thing that you got to understand though. If it's provided, if it's an argument prompt and like they provide someone's like quote or something, then like a lot of students are going to be writing that quote. Like so assume that the person reading your paper knows the prompt. Like if that makes sense. Like you don't need to if the like for instance like if the prompt is like for argument like so and so once said this, like you don't need to restate their quote. I know that's not exactly what you asked, but just know that like a lot of students pull from the prompt and so like try to if you think it's truly going to help your writing and setting context then great, then go for it if that makes sense. We use Hugo for argument essays. Do we need to have evidence from all the categories? Not on the exam, no. My students use an acronym called CHORES. It's basically the same as Hugo, but like there's a couple differences. So for those that are not familiar, like CHORES is current events, history, outside knowledge, which is like sports, pop culture, stuff like that, reading, experience, and science. Hugo is really similar. So I during class, I try to get my students to come up with a couple options per category, but like on the exam, no. Like if you cannot come up with an example from your reading, like so what? And just try to prioritize real world examples like current events or history, just things that actually happened, not like hypotheticals, because those just don't read well, in my opinion. So that would be something. But yeah, no, you can also like another question that's kind of similar to this is like, can I use examples from the same category? Absolutely. Like I had a student last year, he came up to me in the middle of his mock exam and he was like, I can only think of historical evidence. And I was like, okay. And he's like, is that bad? And I was like, no, write your paper. Like, just, I don't care if all 3, 4 examples, whatever you put in there, 2 examples, I don't care if they're all historical, just make sure they're specific. And he was like, oh, okay, good. Because the downside to that acronym is like my student had thought like, oh, you must have like multiple categories of evidence. Now, does it help? Maybe, but like if you only use historical evidence and that's the best you can do, then just make sure it's good evidence. But yeah, in the essay, like there's not like a checklist. Like we don't like say, oh, like they're using Hugo and they didn't do the historical example. They don't, it's not like that. Now your teacher might have preferences. Like your teacher might tell you in class you have to do something, and that's separate. But on the exam, no, it doesn't. It doesn't matter. All right, let's see if there's any more questions over on YouTube. Feel free to type your questions in the chat. And if you're on YouTube and you're not already following, please do so. Feel free to like the live stream on YouTube as well. That helps push it out there to other students. And if you're following over on TikTok, feel free to tap your screen. Let's do this. I hate stuff when people do stuff like this. It's so cheesy. So if you think it's cheesy, forgive me. But if you want a 5 on your exam, tap your screen 5 times to give it 5 likes. I saw somebody doing that the other day and I was like, that's cringy, but we'll see. We'll see if I can get a couple likes because of it. But all right, we got some hearts coming in. Honestly, for those of you that are trying to shoot for like higher exam scores, now is the time during the year to really focus on like, what are you doing well and what can you improve upon? Like, and, talk to your teachers. Like as a teacher, like, if a student comes up to me and says like, hey, like, I'm trying to get this essay to like the next point higher, or like I need some extra practice. Like I like that personally because I'm like, okay, let me see what I can do. So always communicate with your teachers. And if you're interested in more lives like this, thank you for the likes, by the way. I will be going live weekly. So Sunday, right now it's Sundays at 3 p.m. I usually stay on for an hour, but on for almost an hour and a half, which is totally fine. As the exam gets closer, I'm going to be offering more live stuff, either on YouTube and TikTok, or even like I'm looking into the possibility of like hosting like classes for students, like study sessions and stuff. I'm working out the logistics. So feel free to like, make sure you follow, that way you can hear about those, because I want to help students as much as I can. Do you have any tips for on the line referencing questions? Oh, okay. So like when it says like in line 55, what does this mean? Um, you should read some of the surrounding sentences too, because what happened was, this happened in class recently, and a student was like, "Oh yeah, that's why you give us that tip." They just read the one sentence that contained the word, and they tried to answer the question, and then they got it wrong. And then when we were talking about it in class, I was like, "Well, your context clue is this," and it was like the sentence before, and my student was like, "Oh, yeah, shoot, I should have read that whole thing." So you want to read not necessarily the whole paragraph, but read the surrounding sentences, like the sentence before it and after it, in case there's a context clue. Because usually what they do is they choose a word that has multiple meanings. And then, so like if you're not looking at it within the context of like the surrounding sentences, not just the line that it's on, you might miss the meaning. And so my student was like, "Oh yeah, I should have read the other sentences, and that would have made more sense." So that's a tip for the vocab and context is what I call it anyway. Not sure if you covered synthesis essay. How would you introduce the topic? Okay, so for synthesis, here's the thing. Like a lot of students just like rephrase info from the prompt. Um, Sorry if it's really shaky on TikTok. I'm having to like hold my phone so it can charge. And that's why I'm like looking in two different directions. So I apologize. Um, so a lot of students will use info from the prompt, and this is not bad, but like, um, it gets like redundant. Like we score your essays based on like what you individually do, but you don't need this huge like intro. Just usually what I tell my students to do is like if you need to define the topic, like if you need some kind of definition, define what you need to define. Tell us like why the issue is being talked about. Some students really like to do that because that's in the prompt. So they might say like, this issue, some people think this, some people think this, and then they have their thesis. So your intro can be really short. But like basically just kind of explain like what the topic is and what the perspectives are is usually what most students do. But like worst case scenario, you just need your thesis. But I would not stress too much about your introductory paragraphs. It's okay for them to be short, because your body paragraphs are so much more important. So hopefully that helps. But like, don't feel pressure to write a hook. When I first started teaching AP Lang, I would tell my students, "Oh, you need a hook and context in your thesis." You do not need a hook. So if any of my former students come across this video and like from like 2018 and 2019, I am sorry, you do not need a hook. I would tell them like on exam day, if you can't think of it, just like skip it. But like I was like trying to help them become stronger writers and whatever. And I was like, yeah, you need a hook. For the exam, you don't really need a hook. If I'm being honest, I've come to learn that you don't want to waste your time on stuff like that. If you can come up with one quickly, go for it. But otherwise, no. Are there example multiple choice tests on the College Board website? Unfortunately, no. But here are some possible solutions. They have something called the course exam description, which is really for teachers. And it's a really long document, but they have 17 sample questions in there. It's on like page 120, I think. I have an old TikTok video about it. So if you scroll through my feed and you see something about like multiple choice tips from like within the past like month or two, it might be that video. You can also download, there's a free practice test on Marco Learning, which is pretty accurate to the real test if you want some extra practice. You could also use the College Board does have SAT tests that you can download, and then there's Khan Academy. And so some of the questions are not going to match up. But I would use the nonfiction reading passages, and I would use the writing questions that have a question stem. So like a question above it. So not the ones about like verb tense or like a comma or a colon or semicolon, not those. But the ones that say like the writer wants to add this sentence here, should they do so? Those questions are on the AP Lang test. So there are ways that you can practice, but they're not like an official AP Lang resource, if that makes sense. On the real exam day, multiple choice is super easy. I was getting 50% on the practice, and the real thing is easy. That's what I've heard too. I've also heard, granted, like I don't want to jinx anyone. I've also heard that if the passage is really hard, the questions are easy. And if the passage is easy, the questions are hard. So, and my students have kind of confirmed this with some of the practice materials online. They were like, yeah, the passage was super hard, but the questions were easy. Now, granted, that does not mean that that's what students are going to experience on exam day, though. But yeah, my students said, well, it depends on what year we're talking about. Like, I have heard students say a couple years ago, one of the passages was hard. But last year wasn't so bad. So it really just depends. How do I increase reading comprehension? This is tricky. But like, it's first of all, I applaud you for asking. I wish I had like like a strategy that would just like fail proof would work. But I would say what I think would help the most is like um, just number one, practicing and kind of double checking your answers. That's the other thing is like I said this earlier, but like students sometimes just like look at the answers and they're like, oh, the answer is D, and then they like that they move on. Like, go back to your test and look at what D said, and then like think about, okay, why is D right? Because then you can kind of learn how the test is structured and how they create those answer choices and things like that. Something else for comprehension might be to like come up with an annotation system that works for you. Like, I wouldn't annotate a ton, but I would maybe like I've had some students put like a bullet point next to each paragraph about like the main idea if they're worried that they're going to like forget what it's about or if they're not understanding, that kind of thing. What was your composite? I actually didn't take AP Lang in high school. I took AP Lit. I wish I took AP Lang. They just didn't offer it. We actually only had like how many AP classes did we have? I think we had 3, but you were only allowed to take 2 because 2 of them were offered at the same time, which was kind of annoying. We did a lot more like just honors classes. But when I started teaching, I fell in love with AP Lang. I was not a super huge fan of AP Lit. And during my AP Lit test, the fire alarm went off and we were on the second floor of the building and there actually was a fire. Somebody like burnt something in the cafeteria and there was like actual smoke that we could see from our testing room. But the person proctoring our test was like, just keep going. And now that I'm a teacher and I know that they can like report stuff like that and like stop the test and all kinds of stuff, I just think back and I'm like, why did we have to sit there and keep taking that test? Because if you've ever had to analyze a poem with the fire alarm going off, it's really hard. So, and I'm not a huge fan of poetry anyway, so that's why I like AP Lang. But yeah, I wish we had it at my high school. I think they offer it now. I don't know. Maybe I should find out. Maybe I can go and talk to them. Um, let's see. Any more questions on YouTube? I think I answered all of them on YouTube. Any others on TikTok? If you feel like you have questions, here's how you can get some info from me. Number one would be YouTube. I have a bunch of playlists and I'm trying to make at least one new video a week. So feel free to look through those. I have like a cram for the exam playlist and like an AP Lang tips playlist. The cram for the exam one, I try to be more selective with what I put on that one. The AP Lang tips one is like more inclusive. So I try to make the playlist like actually worth it. And then there's like one for each essay type and things like that. Once I get to 10K on TikTok, which I'm pretty close, I can make playlists, I think, on TikTok too. But I also, if you have questions, feel free to reach out on TikTok because I usually try to respond with a video if I can. Or just join the lives each week. Your videos for the essays are great. Helped me a bunch last year to get that 5. Oh, well, thank you. And congrats on your 5. That is awesome. But I appreciate you letting me know. It really does help to know like what works and what doesn't for students. And like, I have very basic video editing skills, but I try. And so, yeah, if you guys have video requests or suggestions, I have a list of videos that I'm going to be redoing because they're like a couple years old. So it's not that the info is bad. It's just that I feel like it could be refreshed. And I also want to do a couple like class with Coach Hall things. That's what I started calling it a couple years ago, where I kind of break stuff down for students because I think that might help. Because I know there's some students that are self-studying and they're just trying to do stuff on their own. So instead of like having you watch a bunch of videos, I want to make it more interactive. So hopefully I can get those. My teacher played your videos a lot in class. Well, if you see your teacher from last year, tell them I said thank you. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, any videos for first year teachers? Oh, yes. I have on YouTube, I have a playlist about teacher tips. And if you are an AP Lang teacher, I go live with Tim from the Garden of English once a month on Light Hall. So feel free to reach out to me if you want information about that. So if you are a teacher and you want to contact me, you can please like comment on one of my videos or something, and I can get you that information as well. But I do have some videos about teaching tips. There's like a playlist for that. And I try to, I have like a teacher email list too. So definitely like comment on something so I can get in touch with you and I can help you out there. My teacher also played your videos. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And tell your teachers thank you because I really appreciate that when they do that. All right. Okay, so sorry again on TikTok, it's super shaky, because I'm having to charge my phone. But I will be back next week at 3 p.m. Eastern. For me, it's 2 p.m. because I'm on Central Time, to answer more questions. But thank you so much for hanging out with me this afternoon. Feel free to like the live on YouTube and TikTok, and feel free to reach out with questions because that helps me serve you better. So thank you so much. All right, have a great day, everybody.